Look, if you're married to a U.S. citizen or you're married to a resident, they might interview you. They? Who's they? Who's them? They, them.
Immigration.
Immigration of the U.S. government. And immigration, could you blame them? There's a lot of fraud out there. What is fraud? What is marriage fraud? How would you define marriage fraud, Marie?
In my opinion, someone who's married to another person for just the privilege of getting his or her paper.
That's the exact definition of marriage fraud. That's called a sham marriage. Marriage is entered into only for the purpose of getting a green card, of circumventing, going around our immigration law. Now, how does immigration fight that? Well, one of the things they do is they interview people. They will conduct a marriage interview. And how do they make a determination as to whether or not a marriage is real or if it's not a real marriage? Justice isn't perfect. It's not perfect.
No.
It's a flawed system.
And it's very slow.
And it's and you know what? It's just people making decisions about your life. Very important decisions. And even people going in front of judges. Sometimes judges make mistakes.
Of course.
Sometimes juries make mistakes. And immigration officers, they are very busy people. They have a lot of interviews to get through. And they don't have a lot of time to do it in. These officers have seen a lot of phony marriages. They're jaundiced. They're suspicious. They're cynical because they've seen all these phony marriages. And because of that, and because they only have a short amount of time to look at your case, if you can't prove to them that you have a real marriage, if you don't have a lot of documentation, if you're not ready to answer questions, they can make some snap decisions that could really hurt you. Somebody could look at you and say, you know what? I have a problem with your marriage. You know what? I have clients come in and they're very indignant. You know, when I tell them about this marriage interview that they're going to have to get ready for, and say, what do you mean? I have a real marriage. Let them prove that this is not a real marriage. Well, it's not the immigration officer's job to prove your marriage isn't real. It's your job to prove that it is real. Now, you're at this interview. Immigration wants to see paper. They want to see paper. What do I mean by papers? What I mean by papers is documentary evidence of the bona fides of your marriage. Evidence that you married your husband or wife in good faith. For example, your driver's licenses. Critical. The first thing that the officer is probably going to do once he swears you in is he's going to ask to see your driver's licenses. And your driver's licenses should reflect your home address, where you live, not somewhere else where you used to live. Because when your driver's licenses don't match up, the immigration officer is not going to be pleased with whatever explanation you provide, that you didn't get around to it, or that you get your mail somewhere else because the mail is more efficient there, or that you're only living at your present address for a short amount of time and you didn't want to go through the rigmarole of changing all the mail. You know, none of those things are good. It's going to plant the seed of doubt in the immigration officer's mind that's going to haunt you throughout the rest of the interview. So please don't do that. Now, if you have a child together, obviously the child's birth certificate is going to be important. Now, this might sound like a strange or a superfluous thing to say, but the father's name should be on the birth certificate. The immigration officer is not going to assume that just because the child has the last name of the father on the birth certificate, that child is indeed the son of the person who is purporting to be the daddy. So no reason why dad should not be on the birth certificate. And if he isn't, it needs to get amended with the state to reflect the actual dad. Joint title to a car, evidence that you own the same vehicle or vehicles. Car insurance, normally people who are married and living together are on the same policy. Tax returns, very important. Immigration does not like to see that you were listing yourself as single if, in fact, you were married during the relevant year that the tax return applies to. You should not be filing taxes as single, for example. It should be in a married category. Some officers prefer to see married filing jointly. They think that's more evidence that you are commingling your assets. Now, back to tax returns again. You could actually get a certified tax transcript from the IRS, and some immigration officers are more impressed with that than a photocopy of a tax return you claim that you filed. In other words, the immigration officer trusts something coming directly from the horse's mouth, meaning proof that you actually filed the tax return with the IRS, getting a statement from the IRS to that effect. In other words, a printout of your tax return for a previous year or years, showing that you filed the taxes together or filed in a married category. Speaking of commingling your assets, what about bank statements? Not just a letter from your bank that you had an account that's open from point A to point B, but actual statements, monthly statements, showing that there's activity on the statements. Immigration's not impressed when you present a bank statement with $3 in it and no one's using it. In fact, what I like to do is, if my clients could give me a printout of their deposited or canceled checks, showing that both of them actually write checks with the account. It's very good stuff to give to an officer. It's good evidence of the marriage. What about a lease or leases for the places you lived at? If you were renting, the two of you should be on there, I imagine, if you want to prove that you were living together. You may own a home together. You might be on a mortgage together. You'll want to present the title to your home if you own a home together, and or a mortgage statement, receipts, bills, receipts. You may have purchased furniture together. You may have purchased large electronics items, and you might have receipts written out to the both of you. The both of you were responsible for it, or the both of you paid for it. What about proof that you traveled together, that you vacationed together? You might have travel itineraries or plane tickets or motel or hotel reservations. You might have photographs of trips you were on together. You might have photos of other events in your life. What I like to do is have my clients provide color copies of the photographs. You don't have to go nuts, but maybe a few sample photos from each of these events in their lives that they might have documented with photographs. And what they could do is caption them at the bottom, indicating what the event was, when it took place, who's in the photo, and that way the photos are given more weight by the immigration officer. Wedding photos are great also. The immigration officer may spend some time looking at the wedding photos as well. So you'll want to present those if you have them. The more evidence you have, in general, the easier time you will have with the officer. Conversely, the less evidence you have, the more the officer is going to be skeptical of the relationship and the more likely it is you're going to have a hard interview, a separation interview where the two of you are interviewed separately, and it's more like an interrogation at that point than an interview. Try to avoid that scenario by presenting a lot of evidence of the bona fides of your marriage. I was at an interview yesterday, and I was in front of a tough immigration officer. And this was a couple where, for the first 2 months of the marriage, they didn't even live together. And we were upfront about that. Why? Because one of them was up in Orlando at school. His wife was down here. And he had to finish up school. And she had some stuff to do down here, apparently. She was busy setting up their house. That was what she was occupying her time with. And thank God that they had an incredible wedding album that really showcased their wedding. Dress, magnificent cake, good times. The officer spent about 15 minutes looking at their wedding album. That wedding album saved the day. I gave a packet. You know what I do? I make my clients get a ton of evidence. And I just slam it down. If it doesn't make a thud, if it doesn't make more than, if you could lift it with one hand, then it's too light. So, and the more evidence you put in and the more evidence that makes sense, the more likely it is that they're going to have an easy time at the interview. And that's what happened with them.